You're going to be formatting the page for CSS Grid, and so it's going to look quite a bit different than the one that you download, and it's going to be mobile friendly. So all of the CSS for all of these fun little things, I used a tooltip for this. All of that CSS is in your page already. The only thing that you are going to have to do is add the CSS grid areas and the template, basically. And then you'll have to do kind of minimal little tweaks for mobile and desktop and that type of thing. But you can see that we've got a header area, we've got a content area, I've got like a little navigation area over here. And then we have another content area here, and at the bottom there is a little footer. And so if I view this on different mobile devices, let me press F12 here, turn this on. And you can see that it does kind of adjust. Okay, and that still works. And then all of the images are already set up to be mobile friendly. And you'll notice when I switch over to phone, I lose the graphics. That was done on purpose. And everything basically goes into one column. Okay, so all the different phones look pretty much the same. And then you get into an iPad, which has its own format. You can see that instead of 2 images, I only have 1. That was done on purpose. And the format for an iPad, as you can easily see because of the graphics, it's a little different because we've got this content area below the header. And if you look at back to a phone, you'll see that we have the navigation below the header. So this is basically what you're going to be creating. Turn this off so you can go back to full screen. And like I said, all of the CSS and content is in here already. Graphics are already in here and they are mobile friendly. So what you need to do is download this zipped file. And I'm going to download this. Into my lesson 11 folder. And then I have to extract it. Now, this happens quite often. When you extract, what it does is it creates a folder and then it puts a folder inside a folder, which does make it hard to link. So what I'm going to do is open this. See how I have Seuss here? I'm just going to take all of this and move it out of this little nested folder. So I'm just going to move it up a level. So it's in the main Seuss folder. Okay. And then this second folder now is empty. So I'm going to delete that. Okay, so now I just have one Seuss folder. It just makes it easier for linking. Then what we need to modify in this is going to be the CSS, and we're also going to have to modify the HTML. Okay, because in the CSS, we're going to be adding grid areas and classes. And then we have to take those classes and put them in our HTML, and that's how we are going to connect the HTML to the grid. So I'm going to open up Seuss in VS Code. And I'm also going to open up my CSS. And let's open this. Hopefully, come on. And you aren't going to really have to mess with the print. We're just going to modify the screen. Okay. So in our screen CSS at the bottom, you will notice that I have some settings already for the media queries. But what I don't have is the grid area and the grid template, and that's what you're going to be adding. So where you're going to be putting the template areas, the grid areas, are right above the media queries. So I'm going to pause this for a sec and add those. So the classes that you add have to be placed into your HTML, and then the little labels for your grid areas need to go into the templates, and they are used to define not only where that content is going to display, but how many columns it's going to occupy. So once you have the grid areas defined, your next step is actually going to be to create the grid container, and that contains the template. And we're going to have a different container defined for mobile, tablets, and desktops. So right after my opening brace for phones is where I'm going to put the container. Let me move box over here. This is where I'm going to put my container class. And in my grid container class, I'm saying the display is grid. And now I'm going to give it the grid template areas. So each column, as I said, is specified with a label, and you do need the same number of columns in each row. Now, for a phone, I could just put, one column in each row. Now, that does not give me much flexibility if I want to make any kind of change. And so this is kind of where it comes down to like a personal preference thing. So if I may want to tweak this, or if I want to show more of a width here, I would probably set this up more like this. Okay, but if you only wanted to do one, that would be okay. And I'm being a lazy typist and copying and pasting. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. It doesn't really matter as long as you have the same number of columns in each row. Okay, and I just chose 3 so it would have some flexibility if I wanted to make adjustments. The other things that are in this mobile phone media query are for the quote box, changing the margins, for the tooltip, also changing little padding, making it smaller because it's mobile, and then the header images are not going to display. So we're basically going to do that same grid container. So I'm going to copy and paste down here for the tablets. So make sure you put it after the opening curly. So the display is still going to be grid. We still need grid template areas, but we are going to adjust them a little bit. So for this, we still want the heading on the first row, so that's fine. But then the second row, we're going to make main content. So I'm going to cut and paste and move my nav section down. Okay, and let's see, then we have a side and then we have the footer. And again, I'm just going to leave 3 columns here, giving me a little flexibility if I want to make changes later on. And the way I set this up is it's looking at a max width of 480, which is pretty standard for a mobile phone. And then for a tablet, it's looking at a minimum width of 481. Okay, so after 480, if the width is 481, it's going to apply this. Okay, and you'll notice that the thing 1 and thing 2 has a ID, and we're not going to display that graphic just because it takes up too much room. Then for the desktop, we're looking at a minimum width of 769. So if the width, let's say, is 800, it'll start by formatting this way, but then it comes down here and it says, oh, nope, it's, it meets this criteria too, so it'll go ahead and apply this. So the criteria that we put in here is going to override what we put in for tablet. And again, this grid container needs to be defined. Oh. So I'm going to start with what I have. And then I'm going to add some more columns because this is a desktop and we do want to mix up the layout a little bit. So we're going to use 6 columns. Now again, it's up to you how many columns you want in your own page. And so what we're going to do here is have 4 columns of main content, 2 columns of navigation on the right-hand side. So let's get rid of nav. And then below the main content, we want our extra aside information. We'll do 4 columns of that, and then the last 2 are going to be nav. And then for the bottom row, that's just going to be footer. And the main thing here is that you need the same number of columns in each row. And like I said, it is super helpful if you kind of draw out how you want this to look, where the different content is going to occupy, because that helps you actually fill in this little grid. Then, let's see, oh, I forgot the grid gap and padding. We better add that. So for mobile, grid gap, this is the gap between the rows and the columns. I don't want a gap, so I'm going to put 0. But I do want some padding between my content and the edge of the grid. So I'm going to make it fairly small here. And that should all go inside my container. So let me move that closing brace down. Okay, so my container basically consists of the display set to grid, the grid template, the specifying the gap, and padding. Now this gap and padding I need to put down here in my laptop and tablet friendly area. And for this, I am going to keep the grid gap at 0, but I got more space, so I'm just going to bump up my padding just a tad bit. And then down here for desktop, I'm still going to have the gap be 0, but I can afford quite a bit more padding. Whoop. And now I'm going to save it. So at this point, I got my layouts defined. I still need to connect these classes, the grid container and all of these grid areas. I've got to connect those classes into my HTML. And that tells it what area in the HTML to display. So I'm going to go over to Seuss and the article, which you'll notice is basically the entire body. Okay, that is going to be our grid container. So I'll say class equals grid container. Then the header. Well, this is where we are going to be putting our title. Okay, so over here, we specified a title class. And so we're adding that here. So our first row is going to be whatever's in the header. Then you'll notice that in here we have several sections. And the first section, we're going to assign the class of menu. Okay, so in our grid, the menu class has a grid label of nav. So it'll display here. And you can see in the different layouts where nav is going to display. Okay, and that is this little segment right in here. The second section is our main content. So we're going to have the class set to content. And over here, our content class has a label of main. So in our grid areas, wherever you see main, that is where that content area is going to display. Then we have another section. This last section has an ID, and that is for some of the media queries, but it does not have a class. And the class that we are going to assign here is also called extra. So if we look, here we've got our extra class, and the label is aside. So you can see where that is going to be located. And where I used the extra class was down here. When we got to a full-size desktop, I wanted to set a maximum width on that image, basically because on a really wide screen, it just looked pixelated, so it didn't look good. And then I wanted to adjust the font size as well. Okay, so we've got all of our sections set up with classes. The only thing that we have left is the footer. Okay, and the class that we are using for that is contact. So we'll say class equals contact. And you can see the contact class has a grid area label of foot. So wherever you see foot, that is where the information is going to display. So at this point, we have connected our HTML to our grid template area. And I'm going to save all of the changes in both. And then I can view this offline. And so let me come up here to Seuss. And I'm going to go into Google Chrome. Okay, so for this, we go into FN, F12 on my laptop and check this out on the different devices. And we'll try landscape. Okay, just to make sure everything looks okay. Okay, and then once everything looks good, you can turn this off and you can transfer your pages.